Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, as she flew over the hostile territory of eastern Afghanistan. The twin engines hummed behind her, and the familiar weight of the aircraft's massive 30mm cannon gave her comfort. She had flown this same bird, tail number 780665, through 37 combat missions without a scratch. Today would be number 38. The radio crackled to life in her helmet. Hawkeye 2-1, this is ground control. We have troops in contact. Grid reference 417235. Enemy forces are dug in on the ridgeline, approximately 200 meters north of our position. Request immediate close air support. Sarah's heart rate quickened as she acknowledged the transmission. Below, she could see the dust clouds and muzzle flashes that told the story of a fierce firefight. American soldiers were pinned down by enemy fire, and she was their lifeline. This was what she had trained for, what she lived for. The A-10 was built for exactly this kind of mission, and Sarah was one of the best pilots in her squadron. She banked the aircraft into a steep turn, lining up for her attack run. The Warthog responded like an extension of her own body. Every control input translated into precise movement. Through her targeting system, she could see the enemy positions clearly marked by her forward air controller on the ground. The soldiers below were counting on her, and she would not let them down. As she began her descent, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with combat. But something felt different today. The enemy fire seemed more intense than usual, more organized. Anti-aircraft tracers were rising toward her position in patterns she had never seen before. Intelligence reports had mentioned increased enemy activity in the area, but this looked like something more sophisticated than the usual insurgent groups. The targeting computer locked onto the first enemy position, and Sarah prepared to unleash the devastating firepower of her aircraft's cannon. The A-10's gun could fire 65 rounds per second, each one capable of destroying armored vehicles. Against infantry positions, it was absolutely devastating. She squeezed the trigger and the aircraft shuddered as the massive gun came to life. But as she pulled up from her first pass, something went terribly wrong. A surface-to-air missile, more advanced than anything the enemy was supposed to have, streaked up toward her aircraft. Sarah threw the Warthog into a violent evasive maneuver, deploying chaff and flares to confuse the missile's guidance system. For a moment, she thought she had escaped. Then the explosion hit. The missile detonated close enough to her aircraft to send shrapnel tearing through the Warthog's armored hull. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel as multiple systems began failing. Hydraulic fluid leaked from damaged lines, and her right engine began losing power. The aircraft that had carried her safely through so many missions was now fighting for its life. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She ran through emergency procedures, trying to maintain control of the damaged aircraft while simultaneously calling for help. The Warthog was famously tough, designed to take punishment and keep flying, but this damage was severe. She could feel the aircraft becoming harder to control with each passing second. Mayday, Mayday, this is Hawkeye 2-1. I am hit and losing altitude. Engines are failing and I have multiple system failures. I am attempting to reach friendly territory, but I may need to eject. Her voice remained steady despite the chaos around her, a testament to her years of training and experience. The ground controller's voice came back immediately, filled with concern. Hawkeye 2-1, we copy your mayday. Search and rescue is being scrambled. Can you maintain altitude and heading for friendly territory? Sarah fought the controls as the aircraft began to lose altitude more rapidly. The mountains of Afghanistan stretched out below her, unforgiving terrain that offered few good options for an emergency landing. If she had to eject, survival would depend on how quickly rescue forces could reach her. In enemy territory, that might not be fast enough. As she struggled to keep the Warthog airborne, Sarah thought about her crew chief back at base, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who maintained her aircraft with pride and dedication. He had painted her name on the canopy rail and always made sure 780665 was in perfect condition before every mission. The thought of letting him down, of losing the aircraft he cared for so much, was almost as painful as the prospect of her own death. The right engine finally gave up completely, trailing black smoke as it seized. With only one engine remaining and hydraulics failing, the Warthog was barely controllable. Sarah knew she had minutes, maybe less, before she would be forced to eject. But she was still over enemy territory, and ejecting here would mean almost certain capture or death. She pushed the aircraft's nose down slightly, trading altitude for airspeed as she tried to stretch her glide as far as possible toward friendly lines. Every foot she could gain might make the difference between rescue and capture. Behind her, she could hear radio chatter as rescue forces scrambled to reach her potential crash site. The mountains seemed to rise up to meet her as the Warthog continued its controlled descent toward the earth below. The mountains of Afghanistan grew larger in Sarah's windscreen as her crippled A-10 continued its death spiral toward the earth. Warning alarms blared in her helmet, and the acrid smell of smoke began to fill the cockpit. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the aircraft would be completely uncontrollable, and she was still 15 miles from the nearest friendly outpost. Sarah's left hand moved to the yellow and black striped ejection seat handle between her legs. Every pilot dreaded this moment, the point where you had to trust your life to a rocket-powered seat and a parachute. She had practiced this procedure countless times in simulators, but the real thing was terrifyingly different. Below her, the rocky terrain offered no good landing spots, only jagged peaks and deep valleys controlled by enemy forces. Control, Hawkeye 2-1. I'm ejecting in 10 seconds. My position is approximately 14 miles northeast of Checkpoint Charlie. Tell my husband I love him. Sarah's voice cracked slightly on those last words, the first sign of emotion she had shown during the entire emergency. She pulled the ejection handle. The world exploded around her as the ejection seat's rocket motor fired, launching her upward with tremendous force. The canopy above her head shattered and blew away in the slipstream as she was violently separated from the aircraft that had been her protection and her weapon. For a moment she was tumbling through space, completely at the mercy of physics and engineering she could only hope would work as designed. The drogue parachute deployed first, stabilizing her wild tumble through the thin mountain air. Seconds later, her main parachute opened with a sharp jerk that nearly knocked the wind out of her. Suddenly the world became quiet except for the sound of wind through her parachute lines and the distant rumble of her A-10 as it continued its dive toward the mountains without her. As Sarah descended under her parachute, she watched her beloved Warthog impact the side of a mountain in a spectacular fireball. The aircraft that had carried her safely through so many missions was gone, reduced to scattered wreckage and smoke. She felt a deep sense of loss, but there was no time to mourn. Her own survival was far from guaranteed. She looked down at the terrain approaching below her and felt her heart sink. She was drifting toward a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges. Perfect terrain for an ambush. Even worse, she could see movement on the ridgeline to her east, figures that were definitely not American soldiers. The enemy had seen her ejection and was already moving to intercept her landing site. Sarah used her parachute's steering toggles to try to guide herself toward better terrain, but her options were limited. The mountain winds were strong and unpredictable, making precise control nearly impossible. She aimed for a small clearing on the valley floor, hoping to at least avoid landing in the rocks or trees that covered most of the surrounding area. As the ground rushed up to meet her, Sarah prepared for impact according to her survival training. She kept her feet and knees together, bent her knees slightly, and prepared to roll when she hit the ground. The landing was harder than she had expected, and she felt something in her left ankle give way as she tumbled across the rocky ground. Pain shot up her leg, but she forced herself to ignore it. The parachute dragged her several feet across the rough ground before she managed to hit the quick-release buckles on her harness. She rolled to her feet, favoring her injured ankle, and immediately began gathering up her parachute. The white silk would be visible for miles and would draw enemy forces directly to her position. Sarah's survival training kicked in as she assessed her situation. She was injured, alone, and deep in enemy territory with no immediate prospect of rescue. Her survival radio was intact, and she had her service pistol and a small amount of emergency supplies in her survival vest. But against the number of enemy forces she had seen moving in her direction, she was badly outgunned. She limped toward a cluster of large rocks that would provide some concealment and began setting up a defensive position. Her ankle was definitely sprained, possibly broken, which would make evading pursuit nearly impossible. She would have to make her stand here and hope that rescue forces could reach her before the enemy did. The radio crackled to life as she reached cover. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Rescue Control. We have your position and are dispatching assets to your location. Estimated time of arrival is 40 minutes. Can you maintain your position and stay hidden until then? 40 minutes. Sarah looked at the enemy forces moving down the ridgeline toward her position and knew they would be on top of her in less than half that time. She keyed her radio with grim determination. Rescue control, I am injured and have enemy forces closing on my position. I will do my best to evade and survive until you arrive, but it's going to be close. As she spoke, the first shots rang out from the ridgeline above her. The enemy had spotted her position and was beginning to close in. Sarah drew her pistol and prepared for the fight of her life. She thought about her husband back home, about the crew chief who maintained her aircraft, about the soldiers she had been trying to protect when everything went wrong. She would not give up without a fight. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor. In the gathering darkness, Sarah would have to survive against overwhelming odds until help could arrive, if it could arrive at all. Sarah pressed her back against the cold stone of the boulder that provided her only cover, as bullets whined overhead and sparked off the rocks around her. The enemy forces had reached the valley floor and were advancing on her position from 3 directions. Her injured ankle throbbed with each movement, making it impossible to relocate to better cover. She was trapped. Through her survival radio, she could hear the frantic coordination of rescue forces trying to reach her position. But 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. The enemy fighters were closing in, and she could hear their voices calling to each other in the darkness. They knew exactly where she was, and they were taking their time, confident that she had nowhere to run. Sarah counted her ammunition carefully. She had 3 full magazines for her service pistol, 90 rounds total. Against the dozen or more fighters she had seen moving toward her position, it would not be nearly enough. But every round she fired accurately might buy her precious additional minutes of life. The first enemy fighter appeared around the edge of her boulder cover, and Sarah's training took over. She fired twice center mass and the figure dropped. The other attackers immediately increased their rate of fire, forcing her to duck back behind cover as bullets shattered stone inches from her head. Her radio crackled again. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Raptor Flight. We are 2 F-16s inbound to your position. Can you mark your location for close air support? Sarah's heart leaped with hope. But she knew the situation was too dangerous for the F-16s to engage. The enemy forces were too close to her position for the fighters to use their weapons without risking hitting her as well. She keyed her radio while ducking another burst of enemy fire. Raptor Flight, negative on close air support. Enemy forces are within 50 meters of my position. Any ordnance you drop will take me out along with them. The lead F-16 pilot's voice came back immediately. Copy that, Hawkeye 2-1. We'll maintain overhead cover and look for opportunities to engage. Search and rescue is still 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. Sarah looked at her ammunition supply and knew she would never last that long. The enemy fighters were getting bolder, moving closer to her position with each passing minute. She could hear them coordinating their assault, preparing for a final rush that would overwhelm her defenses. Another fighter appeared in her field of fire, and Sarah took him down with a single well-placed shot. But immediately, 2 more took his place, forcing her to expend more precious ammunition. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. She was running out of bullets faster than she was running out of enemies. As she reloaded her pistol with her second magazine, Sarah heard something that chilled her blood, the distinctive whine of an incoming mortar round. The enemy had brought indirect fire weapons to finish her off. She pressed herself as flat as possible against the rocks as the first round exploded 30 meters to her left, showering her position with dirt and stone fragments. The mortar attack was the beginning of the end. With indirect fire weapons, the enemy could kill her without exposing themselves to her pistol fire. They had all the time in the world to adjust their aim and walk their fire onto her position. Sarah keyed her radio one last time. Raptor Flight, this is Hawkeye 2-1. They have mortars and are zeroing in on my position. I don't think I'm going to make it to the rescue. Tell my husband that I died fighting, and tell Staff Sergeant Rodriguez that I'm sorry about his airplane. The lead F-16 pilot's voice came back, filled with determination. Hawkeye 2-1, do not give up. We are not going to let you die down there. I need you to pop a signal flare and then get as low as possible. Sarah didn't understand what the F-16 pilot was planning, but she followed his instructions. She pulled a flare from her survival vest and ignited it, tossing it as far from her position as possible. The red flame illuminated the valley floor and revealed the true number of enemy forces surrounding her. There were at least 20 fighters visible in the flare light, far more than she had realized. The second mortar round exploded only 15 meters away, close enough that the blast wave knocked her down and left her ears ringing. Stone fragments cut her face and hands, and she could taste blood in her mouth. The next round would almost certainly be a direct hit. Above her, she could hear the F-16s diving toward the valley floor at tremendous speed. She had no idea what they were planning to do that wouldn't kill her along with the enemy forces. The fighters' jet engines screamed overhead as they made their attack run, but no weapons were fired. Instead, something else happened that changed everything. The lead F-16 flew directly over the enemy positions at less than 100 feet altitude. His afterburners ignited and his engines at maximum power. The shockwave from his supersonic pass was devastating. Windows would have been shattered for miles around if there had been any buildings. But more importantly, the overpressure from the low-altitude supersonic pass knocked every enemy fighter to the ground and disrupted their coordination completely. The second F-16 followed immediately behind, repeating the maneuver from a slightly different angle. The combined effect of both aircraft was like a controlled earthquake. Enemy fighters who had been advancing confidently on Sarah's position were now scattered and disoriented, many of them injured by the massive pressure waves. Sarah raised her head cautiously and could hardly believe what she saw. The disciplined assault on her position had been turned into chaos. Enemy fighters were scattered across the valley floor, many of them struggling to get back to their feet. Their mortars had been knocked over and their communications disrupted. For the first time since her ejection, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. The F-16s had bought her time, but they couldn't repeat that maneuver indefinitely. The enemy forces would recover and regroup. She still had to survive until the rescue helicopters arrived. The supersonic passes from the F-16s had given Sarah a brief reprieve, but she could already see enemy fighters starting to recover and regroup. Some were helping their injured comrades, while others were trying to restore their scattered equipment. The mortars that had nearly killed her were being repositioned, and it would only be a matter of minutes before the organized assault on her position resumed. Sarah used the temporary lull to change her position, dragging herself on her belly to a different cluster of rocks about 20 meters away. Her injured ankle screamed with pain at every movement, but staying in one place would mean certain death. She left a blood trail behind her that the enemy would easily follow. But movement was better than becoming a stationary target. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors began to echo off the valley walls, still distant but growing stronger. Sarah's heart soared with hope, but she knew the rescue was far from certain. The enemy forces would hear the helicopters too, and would redouble their efforts to capture or kill her before help could arrive. Hawkeye 2-1. This is Rescue 1-7. We are two HH-60 helicopters approximately 5 minutes from your position. We need you to mark the safest landing zone you can identify and be ready to move quickly when we arrive. Sarah looked around the valley floor with new eyes, searching for an area large enough for a helicopter to land while still being defensible. The problem was that anywhere suitable for a landing would also be an obvious target for enemy fire. The rescue helicopters would be sitting ducks during the pickup. She keyed her radio while scanning the terrain around her. Rescue 1-7, the valley floor is crawling with hostiles. Any landing zone I can reach will be under direct fire from elevated positions. You're going to need cover fire to get me out of here. The lead F-16 pilot broke into the conversation. Rescue 1-7, this is Raptor lead. We're running low on fuel, but we can provide cover for the pickup. We'll make multiple passes to keep the enemy heads down while you extract Hawkeye 2-1. As if summoned by the radio conversation, the enemy forces resumed their assault on Sarah's new position. But this time their approach was different. Instead of advancing directly toward her, they were trying to surround her completely, cutting off any possible escape routes to a helicopter landing zone. They had learned from the F-16 attacks and were being more cautious. Sarah fired carefully aimed shots at any enemy fighter who exposed himself, but she was now down to her final magazine of ammunition. Each shot had to count because there would be no resupply. The enemy forces seemed to sense her desperation and were becoming bolder, advancing in short rushes between the rocks that littered the valley floor. The sound of helicopter rotors was now clearly audible above the sporadic gunfire. Sarah could see the navigation lights of the rescue helicopters as they approached the valley entrance, flying low and fast to avoid enemy anti-aircraft fire. But she also saw something that made her blood run cold. The enemy had man-portable surface-to-air missiles, and they were setting them up to engage the incoming helicopters. Rescue 1-7, abort your approach. They have SAMs and are preparing to engage you. Sarah shouted into her radio while simultaneously firing at the missile team she could see setting up their weapon system. The lead rescue helicopter pilot's voice came back. calm and professional despite the mortal danger. Hawkeye 2-1, we did not come this far to turn around now. We are coming in whether they have SAMs or not. Mark your position with another flare and be ready to run. Sarah ignited her last signal flare and threw it toward the area she had identified as the best possible landing zone. It was far from ideal, surrounded by elevated enemy positions, but it was the largest flat area within range of her injured mobility. She would have to cover nearly 100 meters of open ground under enemy fire to reach the pickup point. The first rescue helicopter came thundering into the valley at maximum speed, flying so low that its rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris. At the same time, both F-16s made simultaneous attack runs from different directions, not firing weapons but using their speed and noise to create confusion and distraction. The enemy SAM team fired their missile at the lead helicopter, but the pilot was ready for it. He pulled the aircraft into a violent evasive maneuver while deploying flares and chaff to confuse the missile's guidance system. The weapon detonated harmlessly 50 meters away from its target, but Sarah could see more missile teams preparing to fire. As the helicopter settled into a hover over the landing zone, its door gunners opened fire on the enemy positions surrounding Sarah's location. The heavy machine guns mounted on both sides of the aircraft laid down devastating suppressive fire, forcing the enemy fighters to take cover and disrupting their coordinated assault. This was her chance. Sarah forced herself to her feet despite the agony in her ankle and began running toward the helicopter as fast as her injured leg would carry her. Enemy bullets whined around her as fighters on the ridgelines tried to cut her down before she could reach safety. She stumbled and nearly fell twice, but each time managed to regain her balance and continue moving. A rescue specialist was already rappelling down from the helicopter as Sarah approached the landing zone. He hit the ground running and sprinted toward her position, laying down covering fire with his rifle to keep enemy fighters at bay. When he reached Sarah, he immediately began helping her toward the helicopter. "Ma'am, we need to move now. They're setting up for another missile shot," the rescue specialist shouted over the noise of rotor blades and gunfire. Together, they covered the final 30 meters to the helicopter as fast as Sarah's injuries would allow. The aircraft's door gunners continued their suppressive fire, but Sarah could see enemy fighters maneuvering for better shooting positions. Time was running out for the rescue to succeed. The rescue specialist practically lifted Sarah into the helicopter as enemy fire intensified around the landing zone. She collapsed onto the aircraft's floor, gasping with pain and exhaustion as the crew chief immediately began working on her injured ankle. The helicopter's engines wound up to maximum power as the pilot prepared for an emergency takeoff under fire. "Go, go, go," the rescue specialist shouted to the pilot as he and Sarah were hauled aboard. The helicopter lifted off in a cloud of dust and debris, climbing rapidly to escape the intense ground fire. Another surface-to-air missile streaked past the aircraft, missing by less than 50 meters. But the pilot's evasive maneuvers and countermeasures kept them alive. As the helicopter cleared the valley walls and headed toward friendly territory, Sarah felt the overwhelming relief of survival wash over her. She was alive, rescued, and heading home. The crew chief had stabilized her ankle and was checking her other injuries, while the rescue specialist reported their successful extraction to the command center. "Base, this is Rescue 17. We have Hawkeye 2-1 aboard and are heading to Bagram for medical treatment. She is conscious and in stable condition." "Mission successful." The lead F-16 pilot's voice came over the radio frequency, filled with obvious relief. "Outstanding work, Rescue 17. Hawkeye 2-1, this is Raptor lead. Glad to see you made it out alive down there. You gave us quite a scare." Sarah managed to key her survival radio one last time before the crew chief sedated her for the flight to the medical facility. "Raptor lead, I owe you my life. Thank you for not giving up on me down there. That supersonic pass idea was brilliant." As the sedation began to take effect, Sarah heard the F-16 pilot's response through a growing haze. "Hawkeye 2-1, we never leave our people behind. Get some rest now, you've earned it." The helicopter ride to Bagram Air Base passed in a blur of medical treatment and pain medication. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes dreaming about her burning Warthog crashing into the mountainside, other times reliving the terrifying ground battle that had nearly cost her life. When she finally woke up fully, she was in a hospital bed with her ankle in a cast and her husband sitting beside her. "How long have I been out?" she asked groggily, trying to sit up in the hospital bed. "3 days, her husband replied, taking her hand gently. "They flew me in from the States as soon as they confirmed you were alive. The doctors say you'll make a full recovery, but it's going to take some time. Over the next several days, Sarah received a constant stream of visitors. Her squadron commander briefed her on the investigation into her shootdown, revealing that the enemy had somehow acquired sophisticated surface-to-air missiles that were far more advanced than intelligence reports had indicated. Her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, visited to tell her that he was already working on preparing a new A-10 for her, return to flight status, but it was during a visit from the squadron intelligence officer that Sarah learned something that would change everything she thought she knew about her rescue. Captain Mitchell, we've completed our analysis of the mission data from your shootdown and rescue, the intelligence officer said, settling into a chair beside her hospital bed. There are some things about your case that don't add up, and we need to ask you some questions. Sarah was puzzled by the serious tone in the officer's voice. What kind of things? The rescue went perfectly. Those F-16 pilots saved my life. The intelligence officer consulted his notes before continuing. That's just it, Captain. We need to talk about those F-16 pilots. Can you tell me everything you remember about your radio communications with them during the rescue operation? Sarah recounted the events in detail, describing how the F-16 pilots had provided cover during her ground battle and had used supersonic passes to disrupt the enemy assault. She remembered their call signs, their professional communications, and their brilliant tactical decisions that had kept her alive until the rescue helicopters could reach her. The intelligence officer listened carefully to her account, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. When she finished her story, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. Captain Mitchell, this is going to sound strange, but we need to verify some information with you. You said the F-16 pilots identified themselves as Raptor Flight, correct? Yes, that's right. Raptor lead and his wingman? They were overhead for the entire rescue operation. The intelligence officer exchanged glances with another officer who had entered the room during the conversation. Captain, we've checked with every air traffic control facility, every squadron, and every command center in the theater of operations. There were no F-16s airborne in your area during the time of your rescue? None at all. Sarah stared at the intelligence officer in disbelief. That's impossible. I talked to them directly. They made multiple supersonic passes over the enemy positions. The rescue helicopter crew must have seen them too. We've interviewed the rescue crew extensively. They confirm everything else about your story, but they have no memory of any F-16s being present during the operation. According to their account, they extracted you under heavy enemy fire with no air cover whatsoever. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Sarah knew what she had experienced, but the official records told a completely different story. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks recovering in the hospital while military investigators tried to solve the mystery of the phantom F-16s. She insisted repeatedly that the fighters had been real, that she had communicated directly with their pilots, and that their supersonic passes had saved her life by disrupting the enemy assault. But the more the investigators dug into the official records, the more impossible her story seemed to become. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, visited Sarah personally to discuss the investigation. He was a veteran pilot himself, with over 30 years of experience and a reputation for fairness and thoroughness. Sarah respected him greatly and trusted that he would get to the bottom of what had happened. Sarah, I want you to know that no one doubts your integrity or your account of what happened down there, Colonel Harrison said as he pulled up a chair beside her bed. But we have a problem. We've checked every possible source of information, and there's simply no record of any F-16s being in your area during the rescue operation. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her hospital bed, frustrated by the repeated questioning of her memory. Sir, with all due respect, I know what I experienced. Those pilots were as real as you and I. They communicated with me by radio, they provided tactical support, and they probably saved my life. How can there be no record of them? Colonel Harrison opened a thick folder filled with documents and photographs. We've reconstructed the entire timeline of your mission and rescue. We know exactly which aircraft were airborne, where they were positioned, and what communications traffic occurred. The only F-16s in the theater that day were a two-ship formation, conducting a training mission over 200 miles away from your location. He handed Sarah a series of photographs taken by reconnaissance satellites during her rescue. The images clearly showed the rescue helicopters, the enemy forces on the ground, and the chaotic scene of her extraction. But there were no F-16s visible anywhere in the pictures. Sir, maybe they were flying too high to show up in these images. Or maybe the timing was wrong, Sarah suggested, studying the photographs intently. There has to be an explanation, Colonel Harrison nodded thoughtfully. That's what we thought too, so we expanded the investigation. We checked with air traffic control facilities in 3 countries, reviewed radar data from every installation in the region, and even analyzed intercepted enemy communications. There's absolutely no evidence that any F-16s were present during your rescue. The investigation had taken an even stranger turn when they examined the audio recordings from Sarah's survival radio. Her communications with the rescue helicopters and ground control were crystal clear and matched everyone else's memory of events perfectly. But the portions of the recording where she had supposedly been talking to the F-16 pilots contained only her voice, speaking to no one. The radio transcripts show you talking to pilots who apparently weren't there, Colonel Harrison continued. On the recording, we can hear you asking for air support, reporting your position, and even thanking them for their help. But there are no responses from any other pilots on the frequency. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she absorbed this information. She remembered those conversations clearly, remembered the professional voices of the F-16 pilots who had reassured her and coordinated her rescue. But if the radio recordings showed only her voice, what did that mean? Sir, are you suggesting that I imagined the whole thing? That I was hallucinating under stress? Colonel Harrison's expression was sympathetic but troubled. I don't know what to suggest, Sarah. Stress-induced hallucinations are not unknown in combat situations, but your account is so detailed and specific that it's hard to believe it was purely psychological. There's something else we need to show you. He handed her another document, this one containing a detailed analysis of the enemy positions and their condition after the rescue. According to the report, several enemy fighters had indeed been found injured and disoriented, apparently by some kind of massive pressure wave or explosion. Their mortars had been knocked over and their communications equipment damaged, exactly as Sarah remembered. Something definitely happened to disrupt the enemy assault on your position, Colonel Harrison explained. The rescue crew confirms that the enemy fire slackened significantly just before they reached you, which allowed them to complete the extraction. But if there were no F-16s making supersonic passes, what caused this disruption? The mystery deepened when investigators found fragments of aircraft debris near the crash site of Sarah's A-10. But when the wreckage was analyzed, they discovered something that made no sense. Mixed in with the remains of her Warthog were small pieces of metal that definitely came from a different aircraft, an aircraft that had impacted the ground at high speed somewhere in the same general area. We found debris from a second aircraft crash. Sarah, the metallurgy analysis shows it came from an F-16, but we have no record of any F-16 being lost in that area. In fact, we have no record of any F-16 losses anywhere in the theater during the entire month surrounding your incident. Sarah stared at the debris analysis report, trying to understand what it meant. Sir, could it be wreckage from an older crash? Maybe something that happened years ago? That's what we thought initially, but the metal shows clear signs of recent oxidation and impact damage. This aircraft crashed within days of your shoot-down, possibly at the same time, but according to every official record we have, no F-16 was lost during that period. The investigation had reached an impasse. Sarah's account was detailed and consistent. The enemy forces had definitely been disrupted by something during her rescue, and there was physical evidence of an F-16 crash in the area. But there was no official record of any F-16s being present, and no pilot had been reported missing. Colonel Harrison closed the folder and looked directly at Sarah. There's one more thing we need to check, and it might help explain what happened. We're going to dig deeper into the history of that area, see if there are any previous incidents that might be related to your case. Sometimes the answers to today's mysteries can be found in yesterday's records.